Day 9 of rain. You're sitting back under a lip of rock, watching it come off the edge in a sheet, and you're not worried about it even slightly. No roof in any sense you'd recognize, no dry clothes, no dry socks, no concept of a sock. Your hair's been soaked since sometime last week, and you stopped noticing around day 4. This is the best news your family has had in 2 years. Down in the valley, the pans that were cracked mud all spring are lakes again. The herds that walked away are walking back. The tubers your mother taught you to dig are swelling underground where nobody can see them yet. And in about 6 weeks, food stops being a problem you have to think about every single morning. That's what the sound on the rock means. Not delay, not inconvenience, not a ruined anything. It means abundance, arriving loudly, for free, out of the sky. Nobody in your group is asking when it stops. Nobody wants it to stop. If it kept up for another 3 weeks, that would be better. And everyone knows it. Now hold that next to the last time it rained where you live. We are, as a species, spectacularly rude about rain now. We built a phrase. Rain check. That means a thing you were looking forward to didn't happen. We say nice weather to mean no water is currently falling, which is a strange definition of nice coming from an animal that is roughly 60% water and survives entirely on other things made of water. Entire industries file it under bad weather. Bad. As though the sky had misbehaved and somebody ought to have a word with it. There are people on television who apologize for it too. Sincere, professional apologies, broadcast to millions, for the arrival of the substance that grows every single thing anyone has ever eaten. So, when did that flip? When did rain stop being the best possible news and start being a minor personal insult? And why does the deep record of our species, the bones, the abandoned shorelines, the mud pulled up from the bottom of lakes, show almost none of the dread we now attach to a 7-day forecast? You've probably absorbed a version of prehistory where the weather is the antagonist. Cave as shelter from the storm. Fire as a wall against the cold and the wet. Life as a long defensive campaign against exposure. With rain, endless, grey, unrelenting, as the thing that would eventually break people down. It's a reasonable thing to believe, and parts of it are true. Wet plus cold really does kill. Hypothermia doesn't need snow, just water and wind and time, and it takes people out faster than starvation ever could. And then there's the mythology, which seems to close the case. Gilgamesh, Noah, Deucalion, Manu. Cultures that never touched each other, all keeping a story about water that would not stop coming. That looks a lot like a species remembering something. Except the pieces don't fit as cleanly as they look. Caves, for a start, are not dry. They're wet by definition. The reason a limestone cave exists at all is that water spent a few 100,000 years dissolving the rock. They drip, they flood. They grow their own weather. And most people never lived in them. Caves show up constantly in archaeology because caves preserve, which is a fact about our evidence and not a fact about ancient taste in real estate. The flood myths have a problem of their own. Read them closely, and most aren't about rain at all. They're about rivers jumping their banks and seas coming inland, sudden water, water in the wrong place. Which is a different fear entirely from the sky simply not shutting off. And the geography is stranger than the myths. Almost all of human history happened in the tropics and subtropics, where rain isn't a random event that ambushes your Saturday, it's a season. It arrives on a schedule, it has a name, and the entire year is built around it. In monsoon country, endless rain describes about a third of the calendar, every single year, forever. And nobody living there has ever treated it as a slow-motion catastrophe. They treat it as the stretch when the world refills. But the timeline is where the whole picture comes apart. If rain were a constraint on human life, then human range should shrink during wet stretches and expand during dry ones. That's what a threat does to a population. What actually shows up in the record is the exact opposite. In every region we can measure, every time. Wet periods are when people spread. Dry periods are when they vanish from places they'd occupied for thousands of years. And here's the part most telling Skip. That climate record doesn't come out of ruins or artifacts at all. It comes out of mud, long tubes of it, drilled from lake beds and ocean floors, layer by layer, going back millions of years. The mud is what changes the question. Underneath every version of this story sits an assumption nobody says out loud, that the map holds still. The Sahara is where the Sahara is. The desert is a permanent feature. The grasslands are somewhere else, and anything different is recent news. Juan Cruz Larasuaña, a Spanish geologist who spent years working through Saharan dust records, went at this from an angle that sounds almost too simple. Every year, wind lifts dust off North Africa and drops a share of it into the Mediterranean, where it settles onto the seabed and stays. Thick dust layers mean a dry Sahara. Thin dust layers mean a green one. Read the column from the bottom up, and you've got a rain gauge running back 8 million years. One nobody had to build, maintain, or remember to check. He and his colleagues counted more than 230 of them. 230 separate stretches when the Sahara was green. And green here doesn't mean a few brave shrubs. It means savanna, rivers, lakes big enough to have their own weather, hippos in the Sahara, routinely, grass out to the horizon in every direction. The cycle runs about every 21,000 years, driven by a slow wobble in the tilt of the earth that swings the monsoon rains north and then lets them fall back. The most recent green phase ended around 5,000 years ago, which is late enough that Egypt was already building. And the cycle itself is older than our species by a factor of about 25. The desert isn't the default setting then. It's the low point of a rhythm we happen to be standing in the middle of. Every word ever written by a human being was written during one dry phase. We didn't survive the wet periods. Those wet periods largely built us, all of which is easy enough to say about mud. People are harder. And in 2000, a team crossing a dune field in Niger's Tenere, the stretch of Sand Tuareg called the desert within a desert, found human bone lying loose on the surface. They weren't looking for it. Paul Sereno, the paleontologist leading the expedition, was in the country hunting dinosaurs. What his team had walked into, at a place now called Gobero, was around 200 graves. He went out for dinosaurs and found a cemetery, which is the kind of bad luck most scientists would take. Elena Garcia, the pottery specialist brought in to work out who these people had been, stood on that dune field and said she was looking at more human skeletons than she'd seen in every previous dig of her career combined. The excavations turned up 2 separate populations, separated by a 1,000-year gap. The first arrived roughly 10,000 years ago, when the Sahara was at its wettest, and they were tall, 6 feet and better. The second came about 7,000 years ago, and herded cattle. Scattered through the site, bone harpoons, fish hooks, pottery. In the dry lake bed next door, the bones of Nile perch 6 feet long. Crocodile, hippo, elephant, giraffe, warthog, python. Sereno described walking through it and realizing that everywhere he looked were the bones of animals that don't live in deserts. What Gobero holds is 5,000 years of continuous lakeside life, fishing, herding, burying the dead in the same ground for 200 generations, in what is now some of the driest sand on the planet. Even the most recent burials there beat the first pyramid by about 1,000 years. One grave, dated to roughly 5,300 years ago, holds a woman and 2 children, arranged facing each other, their hands together. Somewhere under those dunes is the best fishing story somebody ever told. A Green Sahara isn't only a story about the Sahara, though. Grass is a road. When the rain belt moves north, it doesn't stop at a border. It opens a continuous corridor of survivable ground running from Central Africa up through the desert and out across Arabia, and everything that eats grass walks it. Michael Petraglia has spent much of his career pulling drowned shorelines out of satellite imagery of the Arabian Peninsula, and the running count is somewhere around 10,000 dead lakes. His teams have visited a fraction of them. Most of those visits turned up Archaeology, which is a hit rate that should make somebody nervous about the other 9,000. At one of them, a site in the Nefud called Al-Wusta, a paleontologist out for a walk in 2016 spotted a single finger bone sitting in the sand. Uranium dating put it at 88,000 years old, making it the oldest directly dated fossil of our species outside Africa and the Levant. Around it lay hundreds of stone tools, freshwater snail shells, and hippo bones. 88,000 years is roughly 28,000 years earlier than the date a lot of textbooks still print for humans leaving Africa. Al-Wusta means, more or less, the middle one. What turned up there was the middle bone of a middle finger, which is either a coincidence or the desert offering an opinion. The meaning underneath it is bigger than the bone. Nobody crossed a desert to get out of Africa, because there was no desert to cross. We walked over grass, from lake to lake, behind animals that were themselves following the rain. And when the rain pulled back south, the corridor closed, and whoever was on the far side stayed there. The great human dispersal, the one that ends with people on every continent, didn't run on grit. A weather window opened, and we went through it. Grassland rain is the easy version, though. The place that should have beaten us is rainforest. The wettest, moldiest, most parasite-heavy environment that exists on land, where the canopy blocks the sun. The game is small and fast, and 40 feet up a tree, and nothing you own ever fully dries. Fahian Lena is a cave in southwestern Sri Lanka, and people were living in it 48,000 years ago. A team working there went through something like 14,500 fragments of bone and teeth from the site. What those people were eating, overwhelmingly, was monkey and squirrel, which is the hardest dinner on the menu. It's small, it's fast, and it's already 40 feet above you reviewing its options. They were taking it with a toolkit of bone points and tiny stone blades that most likely adds up to bow and arrow. 48,000 years ago is before the last ice age even hit its worst, and about 35,000 years before anybody on Earth deliberately planted a seed. The part that should stop you is what they didn't do. Across roughly 40,000 years of hunting the same species in the same forest, they never crashed the population. They were consistently taking adults and leaving the breeding stock, which requires knowing monkey life cycles well enough to manage them. 40 millennia of harvesting a resource without exhausting it is a record no modern industry has come within shouting distance of. Nobody in there was clinging on in a place that hated them. They were specialists in the wettest habitat on Earth, and they were good at it for longer than farming has existed. What that competence looked like hour to hour, on an ordinary wet day, is the part we almost never get to see. Except that a man died in the Alps about 5,300 years ago, and got frozen into a glacier with every single thing he was carrying. Otzi's outer layer was a cape of woven grass that hung down past his knees. His shoes had bearskin soles, deer-hide uppers, and grass packed inside as insulation. A grass cape sounds like the worst rain gear ever conceived, right up until you think about it for 10 seconds. Dried grass sheds water down its length, weighs nothing, costs nothing, and if it wears out, you make another one before dinner. In his belt pouch was a lump of processed Fomes fomentarius, tinder fungus, soaked and beaten into a felt called amadou, which will catch a spark when nothing else in a soaked landscape will. And he was carrying a birch bark container, packed with maple leaves and live embers. Sit with that one. He wasn't carrying away to make fire. He was carrying fire itself, in a box, walking. In wet country, you don't start a fire, because starting a fire in the wet is miserable and slow, and sometimes impossible. You move one that's already going. You know the specific dread of watching your phone drop under 10% with no charger anywhere. Now attach, and also tonight, everyone gets cold to it, and you've got the emotional weight of that little bark box. And none of it was emergency equipment. That's the whole point. It's ordinary kit, carried by an ordinary man on a routine trip, because wet was a normal condition of being alive, and the fixes for it were as boring and settled as the raincoat in your hall closet. Endless rain isn't frightening when the entire technology of dealing with rain is something your grandmother taught you. If rain wasn't the thing that could end you, though, something was. Between 2005 and 2007, a drilling project led out of Syracuse University pulled long cores from the floor of Lake Malawi, the fourth largest lake on the planet by volume, and deep enough to hold a continuous climate record going back more than 1 million years. What the cores showed, in 2 long stretches between roughly 135,000 and 95,000 years ago, is that the lake fell by 550 to 600 meters. Not 5 or 6, 600. That's a drop about twice the height of the Eiffel Tower. Straight down. One of the largest bodies of fresh water in the world, reduced to a remnant sitting at the bottom of its own basin, with the shoreline retreated so far that the ecosystems around it collapsed and the fish communities inside it were rearranged. And the same drill cores from Tanganyika and Bosumtwi, on the other side of the continent, show it happening there too. This wasn't regional. Most of tropical Africa went dry at once, for tens of thousands of years at a stretch. That window overlaps with the period geneticists have long argued our species was at its smallest and most precarious. A population thin enough to leave a permanent signature in everyone alive today. The team that drilled Malawi put that connection right in the title of their paper. That's the actual shape of the threat, not water arriving. Water leaving and not coming back for longer than anyone's grandparents could remember it being different. You can watch that same fear get written down the moment humans start writing anything at all. The Egyptian year opened with a season called Akhet, which means the inundation, the flood, when the Nile rose and spread across the fields, and left behind the black silt the entire country was named for. It had its own god, Hapi, who was drawn as a heavy-bellied figure with full breasts, the standard visual shorthand for fertility and plenty. To track it, they built nilometers, graduated wells and staircases sunk into the river, marked off in cubits, watched by priests. Around 16 to 18 cubits was an excellent year. Below about 12, the water wouldn't reach the high fields, and that meant famine. An entire civilization ran its tax code off a stick in the water. On Sahel Island near Aswan, there's a boulder carved with an account of 7 straight years when the Nile refused to rise, and the country starved, and the king went looking for a god to blame. Nobody in Egypt ever carved a monument to too much rain, and it barely rains in Egypt at all. Every drop that made that country work fell 1,000 miles upstream in the Ethiopian highlands, on people the Egyptians would never meet in a season they could not see. They just sat downstream in the sun and waited to find out how much of it there had been, which makes them, as far as anyone can tell, the first civilization to live entirely on weather that happened somewhere else. You live in that same arrangement, and you check it a lot more often than they did. Pull down the weather on your phone. You've done it within the last week. And there's the row of little icons across the next 7 days, and 3 or 4 of them are the grey ones with the drops underneath. And something in you sags, slightly, automatically, before you've even thought about what you had planned. That's the same piece of information a human being has been receiving for 300,000 years. A week of rain, guaranteed. And, for something like the first 290,000 of those years, it was the single best forecast you could possibly get. Rain didn't get less important. We need it exactly as much as we ever did. What changed is that we moved it. The water in your glass fell somewhere you've never been, possibly years ago, and traveled to you through a reservoir and a few hundred miles of pipe. Your food grew under a sky you'll never stand beneath. Every useful thing rain does for you now happens far away and gets delivered quietly, on a schedule, by people you'll never meet. So the rain that actually reaches you personally arrives with its entire benefit stripped out. All that's left is the wet part. The part that soaks your shoes and cancels the thing you wanted to do. I'm not knocking any of that. Detaching human survival from local weather is one of the genuinely great achievements, and it's the reason a bad rainy season is an inconvenience for you instead of a funeral. But it does make us the first people who ever experienced rain as pure cost. Your body, meanwhile, hasn't been told. Rain on a roof is one of the most common sounds people deliberately play to fall asleep. The smell that comes up off dry ground when the first drops hit has its own word in more or less every language humans have built. Something old in you still hears water arriving and reads it as good. Next time the forecast goes solid grey and you cancel the thing and stay in, do one specific thing. Check yourself around 11 at night when it's coming down hard on the window and you're warm and you go under faster than you have all week. Call that cozy if you want. It's older than cozy. A very old piece of you, checking the sky and finding it generous. And tell me which one's worse where you live. A week of rain or a month without one? I have a feeling the answer depends almost entirely on how far you live from the ground your food grows in, and I'd like to know whether I'm wrong.